This medieval clothing was made from what people could grow, raise, or hunt. It was a world of natural materials. The most basic of these came from the ground. For thousands of people, from the poorest farmer to the richest queen, the most important plant was flax. Flax gave them linen. Linen was the fabric of their underwear. Everyone, no matter their social rank, wore a linen shirt or camise next to their skin. It was soft, absorbent, and easy to wash compared to wool. It was the layer that protected their expensive outer clothes from the sweat and dirt of the body. Making linen was a lot of work. It was a long process that took up much of the year. First, you had to grow the flax. The plants grew tall and thin with small blue flowers. When they were ready, they weren't cut, but pulled up by the roots to get the longest possible fibers. Then the work really began. The flax stalks had to be retted. This is basically a controlled rotting. The stalks were submerged in a pool of stagnant water or a slow-moving river. Sometimes they were just laid out in a field to let the dew do the work. This process smelled terrible, but it was essential. It broke down the pectin that held the woody core of the stalk to the valuable fibers on the outside. After a few weeks of retting, the stalks were taken out and dried. Then came the physical labor. The stalks were broken with a wooden tool, a simple hinged board that crushed the woody part of the stem into small pieces called shives. After breaking came scutching. Someone would hang a bundle of the broken flax and beat it with a long wooden knife. This knocked the shives away, leaving behind the long, stringy, raw fibers. They looked like hanks of coarse blonde hair. But it still wasn't ready to be spun. The fibers had to be heckled. This meant pulling them through a series of metal combs, each one finer than the last. The heckling process cleaned the fibers, removed the last of the woody bits, and separated them into different grades. The longest, finest fibers were called line. The shorter, coarser fibers were called tow. Only then could it be spun into thread. For most of the Middle Ages, spinning was done with a distaff and a spindle. A woman would tuck the distaff, a short stick holding the fluffy mass of flax fibers, into her belt. She would then pull out a few fibers, twist them together, and attach them to a weighted spindle. She would give the spindle a twirl, and as it spun, it twisted the fibers into a continuous thread. It was a slow, constant task that could be done while walking, watching children, or sitting by the fire. The spinning wheel was introduced later in the period, which made the process much faster. Once they had thread, they could weave it into cloth. Weaving was done on looms, which could be large and complex or small and portable. The result was linen cloth. The finest, softest linen, made from the best line fibers, was used for the chemises of nobles, for veils, and for altar cloths in churches. It was often bleached white by laying it out in the sun for weeks. Coarser linen, made from tow, was used for the shirts of laborers, for sacks, and for towels. Linen was strong and cool to wear in the summer, but it wrinkled easily. It was the workhorse fabric for everything that needed to be clean and durable. Bed sheets, coifs, aprons, and the basic underpinnings of every single person's wardrobe were made of linen. Other plants were used too, but they were less common for clothing. Hemp was grown widely. It produced a fiber that was even stronger than flax, but it was much coarser. Making it into wearable cloth was difficult. Most hemp was used for ropes, sails, and rough bags. A very poor person might have a tunic of rough hemp cloth, sometimes called hempen homespun, but it would be scratchy and uncomfortable. Nettle was another source of fiber. Like flax, the stalks of the stinging nettle plant contain long, strong fibers. The process was similar to making linen. People would harvest the nettles, ret them, and process them to extract the fibers. The nettle cloth could be surprisingly fine and soft, almost like linen, but it was never produced on a large scale. It was more of a local or emergency material. For most people, when they talked about cloth from a plant, they were talking about linen. It was the constant, necessary fabric of their lives, born from a simple blue flower and a whole lot of hard work. If linen was the underwear of the Middle Ages, wool was everything else. Wool was the fabric of medieval Europe. It clothed almost everyone, from shepherds to kings. It was versatile. It could be spun into a thread as fine as silk or a yarn as thick as a rope. It could be woven into a fabric that was light and airy, or one that was so thick and dense it was almost waterproof. The entire economy of some nations, especially England, was built on the backs of sheep. It all started with the sheep. Not all sheep are the same. Different breeds produce different types of wool. Some had long, coarse fibers, good for rugged outer garments and blankets. Others, like the sheep that would eventually become the merino, had much finer, softer, and more valuable fleece. The quality of the pasture and the care of the flock also affected the quality of the wool. Shearing happened once a year, in the spring. It was done with hand shears that looked like a large pair of scissors with a U-shaped spring at the top. It was hard work. A good shearer could remove the entire fleece in one continuous piece. After shearing, the wool was dirty. It was full of grease, dirt, and bits of vegetable matter. It had to be scoured. This meant washing it in a large vat of hot water, sometimes with stale urine or a clay-like substance called fuller's earth to help cut through the natural grease called lanolin. The cleaned wool was then laid out to dry. Next, the fibers had to be prepared for spinning. There were two main ways to do this. For longer wool fibers, they were combed. This involved pulling the wool through a pair of large, heavy combs with long metal teeth. The combs were often heated to help the process. Combing straightened out the fibers and laid them all parallel to each other. This produced a smooth, strong yarn called worsted. For shorter wool fibers, they were carded. Their carders were a pair of flat wooden paddles with metal teeth embedded in them. The wool was placed between them and the paddles were pulled in opposite directions. This fluffed up the fibers and mixed them together into a soft, airy roll called a rollag. This produced a fluffier, warmer, but less strong yarn called woolen. Just like with linen, the prepared wool was then spun into yarn using a spindle and distaff, or later a spinning wheel. Women did most of the spinning. It was a skill every woman was expected to have. The phrase the distaff side came to mean the female side of a family because of this constant association. The yarn was then woven into cloth. Weaving was a skilled trade often done by men on large looms. They could create simple plain weaves or more complex patterns like twills. The size and quality of a piece of woven cloth, called broadcloth, was often regulated by guilds to ensure a consistent product. But for many types of woolen cloth, weaving was not the final step. The most important process was called fulling, or walking. The woven cloth was taken from the loom and put into a trough of water, fuller's earth, and often stale urine. Then, people had to get in and walk on it for hours, pounding it with their feet. This process matted the wool fibers together, shrinking and thickening the cloth. It made the fabric much denser and more resistant to wind and rain. Later in the period, this exhausting work was done by water-powered mills with large wooden hammers that pounded the cloth. Fulling mills were a major technological advance. The fulled cloth was then stretched out on a large frame called a tenter, held in place by tenter hooks to dry flat. The variety of wool cloth was enormous. A peasant might wear a tunic of rough, undyed homespun. This was wool that was spun and woven locally, maybe even within their own family. It was coarse, scratchy, and often brownish or gray, the natural color of the sheep. A wealthy merchant, on the other hand, would wear broadcloth that had been expertly produced, fulled, and dyed a rich color. The finest wools from England were highly prized across Europe. They were turned into luxury fabrics in the great cloth-making cities of Flanders. The quality of wool cloth was a direct indicator of your wealth and status. You could tell a lot about a person just by the feel and look of their woolen cloak or tunic. The wool was used for nearly every type of outer garment tunics, dresses, cloaks, hose, hoods, and hats. It was warm, it was durable, and it took dye well. It was the quintessential material of the medieval world. While most people lived their lives in linen and wool, the wealthy had other options. For the nobility, high-ranking clergy, and rich merchants, clothing was not just about staying warm or decent. It was about displaying power, wealth, and status. This required materials that were rare, beautiful, and most importantly, expensive. The king of these materials was silk. Silk was a thread of pure legend. For much of the early Middle Ages, Europeans didn't even know how it was made. They just knew it came from the distant east, carried for thousands of miles along the Silk Road. It was a magical material, impossibly light, smooth, and lustrous. It took dye in a way that made colors shine with an inner light. Owning silk was like owning solid gold. The secret of silk was the silkworm. It's not really a worm, but the caterpillar of a moth. The caterpillar eats mulberry leaves and then spins a cocoon around itself with a single, continuous thread of raw silk. This thread can be nearly a mile long. To get the silk, the cocoons are boiled or steamed to kill the pupa inside. Then, workers carefully find the end of the thread and unwind the cocoon. Several of these incredibly fine filaments are reeled together to create a single silk thread strong enough for weaving. For centuries, the Chinese kept this process a closely guarded secret. Eventually, the knowledge spread. The Byzantine Empire became a major silk producer centered in Constantinople. After the Fourth Crusade sacked the city, many of its skilled silk weavers fled to Italy. Cities like Lucca, Genoa, and Venice became the new centers of European silk production in the later Middle Ages. But even when it was produced in Europe, it was still an incredibly labor-intensive and expensive product. Silk was woven into different types of luxurious fabrics. There was simple silk taffeta, smooth and crisp. There was silk damask, where patterns were created by weaving the threads in different directions, so a subtle design of flowers or animals was visible when the light caught it. There was silk brocade, where extra threads, often of gold or silver, were woven into the fabric to create a rich, raised pattern. And then there was velvet. Velvet was the ultimate luxury fabric. It was made by weaving an extra set of threads into the silk cloth that formed small loops. A weaver would then take a special knife and carefully cut all these loops, creating a soft, dense plush pile. Patterned velvet, where some loops were left uncut, was even more complex and expensive. A robe of silk velvet dyed a deep crimson or blue was a statement of immense wealth. Because these materials were so expensive, governments often passed sumptuary laws. These were laws that tried to regulate what people could wear based on their social rank. A merchant's wife might be forbidden from wearing velvet, or a knight might be limited in how much silk trim he could have on his tunic. These laws were meant to keep the social hierarchy clear, but they were very hard to enforce. People always wanted to dress above their station. Another material that was a luxury for most of the period was cotton. Today, we think of cotton as a cheap, everyday fabric, but in medieval Europe, it was an expensive import. It came from India, Egypt, and the Levant. It was grown in a few warm parts of Europe, like Sicily and southern Spain, but not on a large scale. The fibers were shorter than flax and required different techniques to spin and weave. Cotton was valued for its softness. It was used for fine textiles and for padding inside a gambeson, the quilted jacket worn under armor. Sometimes it was mixed with linen to create a fabric called fustian. Fustian was a sturdy cloth with a soft, slightly fuzzy surface. It was more affordable than pure cotton or silk, but still a step up from basic wool. It wasn't until the very end of the Middle Ages, and beyond that, cotton became a more common and affordable material for everyone. For most of the medieval period, if you saw someone wearing silk, velvet, or even fine cotton, you knew you were looking at someone with serious money and influence. Clothing wasn't only made from woven fibers. A whole range of other materials derived from animals were essential for daily life warmth and protection. Leather, fur, and metal were just as important as linen and wool, serving purposes that cloth just couldn't. Leather was everywhere. It was a vital byproduct of animal farming. Since people ate meat, they had a constant supply of hides from cows, sheep, goats, and pigs. Wasting these hides would have been unthinkable, but turning a raw animal skin into durable, flexible leather was a long and very smelly process called tanning. There were a few different ways to tan a hide. The most common was vegetable tanning. The hide would first be cleaned of all flesh and hair, usually by soaking it in a solution of lime or letting it rot slightly. Then it was submerged in a pit or vat filled with water and tannin-rich materials, most often crushed oak bark. The tannins would slowly penetrate the hide, preserving it and turning it into leather. This could take a year or more for thick cowhide. The tanneries where this work was done were famously foul-smelling and were always located on the edge of town, usually downstream. The leather they produced was strong and versatile. The most common use was for shoes. Nearly everyone wore leather shoes. A typical medieval shoe was made using a turnshoe construction. The shoe was sewn together inside out and then turned the right way out, leaving the seams on the inside for a smooth finish. Leather was also used for belts, which were essential for holding up hose and carrying pouches, knives, and other tools. It was made into gloves, aprons for blacksmiths, saddles and harnesses for horses, and tough jackets called jerkins. Softer leather from deer or goats was used for book bindings and pouches for the wealthy. Or fur was the medieval answer to a cold winter. It provided insulation that no woven fabric could match. Like leather, fur came in a wide range of qualities and costs, and it was a powerful symbol of status. For common people, fur was about practical warmth. They used the skins of local animals like rabbits, squirrels, and sheep. A sheepskin cloak, with the woolly side turned in, was a cheap and very effective way to stay warm. Rabbit fur was soft and readily available. It was often used to line hoods and cuffs. For the wealthy, fur was pure luxury. The most prized fur was ermine. This came from the stoat, a small weasel-like animal that turns white in the winter, except for the black tip of its tail. The pure white fur dotted with black tail tips was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. It was a visual shorthand for power. After ermine, sable was highly sought after, a dark, glossy fur imported from Russia. There was another status symbol. It was the winter fur of the red squirrel, which had a gray back and a white belly. Furriers would sew together many of these small pelts in an alternating pattern of gray and white, creating a distinctive checkerboard look that you often see in medieval manuscripts. Like with silk and velvet, sumptuary laws dictated who could wear which furs. A knight might be allowed to wear fox or marten, but not ermine. A merchant might be restricted to rabbit. The fur trade was a huge international business, connecting the forests of northern Europe and Russia with the fashion centers of Paris and London. Finally, there was a very specific type of clothing made of metal armor. For a knight or a professional soldier, armor was their most important garment. It evolved significantly throughout the Middle Ages. For much of the period, the main form of body armor was mail, often called chainmail. It was not made of woven cloth, but of thousands of interlinked iron or steel rings. Each ring was passed through four others and then riveted shut. This created a flexible, mesh-like fabric of metal. A full shirt of mail, called a hauberk, could weigh over 30 pounds. It was excellent at stopping a slashing cut from a sword, but less effective against the point of a spear or a powerful blow from a mace. Underneath the mail, a soldier wore a thick padded jacket called a gambeson or accaton. This was made of layers of linen or wool stuffed with scrap cloth, raw wool, or horsehair. This padding absorbed the shock of blows and prevented the metal rings from being driven into the skin. In the later Middle Ages, craftsmen became more skilled at shaping steel. They began to make solid plates of armor to cover vulnerable parts of the body. This started with reinforcing the knees and elbows, and eventually developed into full plate armor by the 15th century. A suit of plate armor was a complex, articulated steel shell that offered much better protection than mail. It was incredibly expensive, a custom-tailored metal suit that was a testament to the owner's wealth and a blacksmith's skill. The leather straps and buckles held it all together. So, from the simple leather shoes of a peasant to the shining steel armor of a duke, the materials derived from animals were a fundamental part of the medieval wardrobe. A piece of clothing is more than just the main fabric. It's the color of that fabric, the thread that holds it together, and the fastenings that keep it closed. These details were what brought a garment to life. The medieval world was not the drab, brown, and gray place we sometimes imagine. It was filled with color, and how people achieved that color and held their clothes together tells us a lot about their world. So color came from dyes, and dyes came from nature. They were extracted from plants, insects, and even a type of sea snail. The process of dyeing was a specialized craft. A dyer's success depended on their secret recipes and their skill in using mordants. A mordant is a chemical substance, like alum, that helps the dye bind to the fibers of the cloth. Without a good mordant, the color would wash out quickly. Some colors were cheap and easy to get. Yellow was one of the most common. It came from a plant called weld. Weld grew widely and produced a strong, clear yellow. And brown could be made from walnut hulls. These were colors that an ordinary person could afford or even make themselves. The most important colors were red, blue, and black. For red, the most common dye in Europe was madder. It came from the root of the madder plant. Depending on the mordant and the dyeing process, madder could produce a whole range of colors, from a pale orange to a deep, rich red. It was a versatile and widely used dye. Blue came from a plant called woad. The leaves of the woad plant were harvested, crushed, and fermented into a smelly pulp. This created a dye vat that was a complex chemical process. When cloth was dipped into the vat and pulled out, it would be a pale greenish yellow. But as the oxygen in the air hit it, it would magically transform into a deep blue. Wad was the source of blue for everything from the peasant's tunic to the tapestries in a castle. Getting a true deep black was difficult and expensive. Most blacks worn by common people were actually just very dark grays or browns. A real black was achieved by using a combination of tannins, usually from oak galls, and an iron salt mordant. This created a chemical reaction that produced a deep, permanent black. It was often reserved for the formal wear of the wealthy. Then there were the luxury dyes. These were incredibly expensive and signified great status. The most prized red was not from madder, but from an insect. In Europe, this was kermes, a tiny scale insect that lived on oak trees. It took thousands of crushed insects to produce a small amount of dye, but the result was a brilliant crimson or scarlet that was far more vibrant than madder red. Later, cochineal was imported from the New World, providing an even more powerful red. The most legendary dye of all was Tyrian purple. It was made from a specific type of sea snail found in the Mediterranean. It required harvesting tens of thousands of snails to dye a single robe. In the Roman Empire, it was reserved for emperors. By the Middle Ages, the secret was mostly lost, and it was so rare as to be almost mythical, but it was still remembered as the ultimate color of power. Once the cloth was dyed and cut, it had to be sewn together. The thread used for sewing was usually linen. It was strong and durable. For finer garments or decorative embroidery, silk thread was used. It was smooth, strong, and came in bright colors. Sewing was done by hand with needles made of bone, bronze, or iron. Finally, a garment needed to be fastened. For much of the Middle Ages, buttons were not common. When they did appear in the 13th and 14th centuries, they were often small, numerous, and used as a form of decoration on the sleeves of the wealthy as much as for a practical closure. Before that, and alongside them, people used other methods. The most common way to hold clothes together was with laces. Tunics and dresses were often laced up the side or front through hand-sewn eyelets. Hose were held up by lacing them to a belt or to the bottom of a doublet with laces called points. These points often had small metal tips, called aglets, to make them easier to thread. Pins and brooches were also essential. A simple straight pin, made of wire, was a common tool for temporarily holding fabric in place. For securing a heavy cloak at the shoulder, a more substantial brooch was needed. These could be simple bronze rings or elaborate jeweled pieces of gold and silver. They were a form of functional jewelry necessary for keeping warm and a way to display wealth at the same time. Together, these details of color, thread, and fastenings completed the medieval garment, turning simple cloth and hides into the clothing that defined a person's place in the world.